Trump defeated in Venezuela. Today we are witnessing in Venezuela what we predicted on this channel, in detail, a short time ago, a US airstrike and a regime change operation against Nicolás Maduro. Despite the successful capture of Maduro, the US attack was unable to destabilize the Bolivarian regime or trigger a popular reaction against the revolution. Quite the opposite, in fact. So far, Trump's operation represents a failure, and the fantasy of US control over Venezuela, expressed by Trump himself in his speech today, exists only in the wet dreams of the White House hawks. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany, on a truly special day. We're starting the third live broadcast of Demolishing Myths from Berlin. Broadcast number 292, by the way. Thank you very much for joining us. Remember to give us a thumbs up, and if you'd like, you can also support us on Patreon, where we share everything we can't show on YouTube. Joining us from Madrid, Spain, also after a long day, is Juan Antonio Aguilar. Juan Antonio, welcome. How's everything going?
Juan Antonio, bienvenido, ¿qué tal todo?
Welcome. Well, thank you very much. It's also my third time. I'll probably be with you, for example, for half an hour.
No problem.
Because in the end, I neither eat nor drink. Well, here we are.
Juan Antonio,
Juan Antonio, in his speech, Donald Trump made a reckless statement, saying, in a sense, from now on, we control and manage Venezuela from the United States. However, the streets of Venezuela seem calm. Delcy Rodriguez has just delivered an address, the vice president, now evidently in charge after Maduro's abduction, a national broadcast rejecting the invasion, reaffirming Venezuelan sovereignty, and even asserting Maduro as president. And already, for example, in the New York Times, reports and editorials are beginning to appear about Trump's disappointment and surprise at the fact that his attack did not spark a popular uprising against Maduro or the Bolivarian Revolution, but quite the opposite. What scenario are we witnessing right now in Venezuela, Juan Antonio?
First, a quick rundown of the situation and how it's being seen, because we've just watched a Hollywood movie again. Once more, we've watched a Hollywood movie. A dark operation, dark not because it was nighttime, though it was, but dark in the sense that, well, 150 aircraft were involved. I imagine they had their targets selected, they destroy part of the anti-air defense system, and then they head toward Caracas, I don't know. 12 or 15 helicopters flying low, which you could take down with a simple man-pad, one of those shoulder-fired ones. From a rooftop, you launch the rocket and bring down the helicopter. I haven't seen a single tracer bullet. This, to me, is highly suspicious. Not one tracer bullet, which makes it clear that there was some kind of inside action. Where was all the guard that was supposed to be protecting Maduro? Where were they? How come Maduro was there, in Caracas, in a situation like that, allowing them to catch him that way? I don't know. There's something strange about this. I don't dare to speculate because I don't have any data, but it seems odd to me. Well, that, as you know, ends with the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro and his wife, following a complaint filed in a Florida court. These things you're saying, this is absolutely disgraceful. Disgraceful. We've really witnessed an imperialist coup carried out by a genuine criminal idiot like Donald Trump, Epstein's friend, a mobster. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, already has the indictment prepared. Let's see. He's the head of state of a sovereign country. The head of state of a sovereign country. That's what we have to keep in mind. And these gentlemen ignore not only international law, which doesn't even come into play here. It's a mockery. They disregard every possible rule and decide who stays and who goes, and that they're going to govern Venezuela themselves. That was the intention. The intention was to stage a coup, a regime change. And well, we'll analyze why later. But that was the intention. That was the goal. I don't know who might have acted as a fifth columnist.
Yo no sé quién haya actuado de quinta columnista. Yo no sé si ha habido
I don't know if there have been any covert agreements of some kind. I really don't know what might happen in the coming days, what scenarios might unfold. I do know one thing. At this hour of the night, control of Venezuela lies with the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. In other words, it's in the hands of the Bolivarian regime, in the hands of Chavismo. That's the reality. I don't know. We can speculate about what scenarios might open up, but that's the reality right now. Yes, they have kidnapped a foreign head of state, committing an illicit, illegal, and criminal act. They have bombed airports, military bases, the Higuerot airfield, and even the mausoleum where the remains of Hugo Chavez rest. You really have to be vile and despicable, Mr. Trump and his gang of criminals, to bomb a dead man. To bomb a dead man.
Para bombardear a un muerto. Ya hay que ser hijo de eso.
You really have to be quite something. But anyway, fine. I mean, coincidentally, the oil facilities haven't suffered any attacks. Why is that? Why is this happening? We knew something like this could happen. In fact, we've mentioned it in some programs. Well, there isn't enough force, nor do I think they'd make the terrible mistake of invading Venezuela. The most likely scenario would be a decapitation strike, meaning missile launches and so on, against military targets and critical infrastructure, and against visible leaders. But well, it seems the only head they've found is that of President Nicolás Maduro. The rest are all free in making statements, including the governors, the high-ranking military officers, the foreign minister, and so on.
El ministro de Asuntos Exteriores, etcétera, etcétera. Claro, da la sensación.
Of course, it feels like there hasn't been any intention, or they haven't been able to change the regime. Here we can establish two hypotheses. They didn't want to avoid chaos that would make the plundering of Venezuela's resources impossible, for example, a civil war, or they couldn't, and now they're facing a problem because this whole operation is very Hollywood-like. Yes, they have a president illegally detained, but they have nothing else. Nothing else. Let's see how the process ends. Let's see how this develops. What's clear is one thing, and it's something I've already mentioned elsewhere. The United States is at a point where it's now aware of the loss of global hegemony. There will no longer be a unipolar moment. They will no longer be the only superpower that does and undoes as it pleases.
Superpotencia que hace y deshace como quiere. Se encuentra que hay una serie de potencias en el mundo que le van a...
He finds himself facing a number of world powers that are going to confront him. And in light of that, he only had three options, which we've already discussed before. Either he falls into the Thucydides trap and we end up in an open world war, or he maintains the current state of decline, which would lead us into a very long conversation about the variables that indicate that decline, and therefore ends up in a more or less serious collapse of the United States. Or he tries to position himself in a dominant way while accepting that there will be a new multipolar order. I think wisely they've chosen the third option. The other two are very bad. With wars, you know how they start, but not how they end. Starting a world war could first of all end in a nuclear holocaust, and secondly, even if it didn't, there's no guarantee you'd win.
Aunque no se acabará así, nadie te garantiza que vas a vencer. ¿Cuándo? Es decir, los BRICS, por ejemplo.
When? I mean, the BRICS, for example, already account for 47% of the world's GDP, and you don't. In other words, the second option, waiting for the final decline, wasn't very good either. So they've chosen the third option. And the third option is the one expressed in the national security strategy approved by the White House in recent weeks, in which the priority is the absolute control of the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere, meaning the Americas. And therefore, for strategic rear defense, for control of communication routes, and for the need for raw materials and energy.
De materias primas y de energía. Y alguien me dirá, vale.
And someone might say to me, but why would the United States want Venezuela's oil if it already produces so much of its own? Well, I'll give you two reasons. First, the United States race for artificial intelligence. If it doesn't secure greater energy supplies, it's lost. It needs, one way or another, to guarantee, not necessarily to have it right now, which it can more or less maintain, but to ensure that energy for the future in the medium term. And Venezuela does have that energy. 300 billion barrels of oil, 5.5 trillion cubic meters of gas, plus uranium, gold, critical materials, coltan, cobalt, and so on.
El coltán, el cobalto, etcétera, etcétera. Es decir, estaríamos hablando de muchas más cosas, ¿no?
That is to say, we'd be talking about many more things, right? But diamonds, nickel, a whole range of materials also needed for technological development, but above all, energy. And besides, that's another weapon. Because if I have the energy production I have and I control Venezuelan oil and gas, I can pressure the OPEC Plus countries to accept the international oil price changes that suit my interests. For example, the price per barrel can't drop below $50. Why? Because then I'd be putting my entire fracking industry at risk. But I also can't allow it to reach $80. Because then Iran and Russia would prosper at my expense. That is to say, the only way is for me somehow to have the little key. And I get that little key if I can take control in Nigeria, in Venezuela, and maybe in a few other countries. Well, there's some control over a few of the Gulf petromonarchies, right? Mainly Saudi Arabia. And that way, let's say I'm going to control the energy market through prices. Not because I force, though in Venezuela's case, it will be forced, payments to be made in dollars. When Trump says no, I'm going to sell the oil to the Chinese. Of course, your companies will be the ones selling it, the ones extracting it from Venezuela, and you'll tell China to buy it, and to buy it in dollars, because you're not going to allow it to be in any other currency. This is the game, not another one. Of course, there's also the fact that, for control of the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela is a bad example. Just like Cuba, just like Nicaragua, just like other popular regimes have been. It's a very bad example. Let's see if it keeps spreading. So, the best thing is to get rid of that bad example. Others simply by putting the sellout of the moment in charge, the long live freedom, damn it type, and so on. That's enough. But well, Venezuela was more dangerous in that sense, and therefore there's an interest in seeing Venezuela fall. What could happen? Well, so that it doesn't fall into chaos and all this doesn't turn into a farce, let's see if I can manage a transition. Since Maduro isn't around, there would have to be elections in X days, and by then they might already have chosen the person they can put forward for those elections, which might not be Maria Corina Machado, simply because of what Trump said, though you can't really trust that either, but it'll be someone who's a puppet and a sellout in a wasteland. So, hey look, they already have Malay, Katz, the other one, and they'll place their puppet in Venezuela. That's one of the possible scenarios. The other scenario is that, indeed, Chavismo, the Bolivarian opposition, digs in, tries to resist, and then what is Trump going to do? Assume that it was all for nothing, and cover it up with a trial against Maduro, which could also turn him into a martyr for all of Latin America? The prisoner they have in the United States, our prisoner, the one kidnapped by a criminal gang organized in the White House, led by a Crichton, a mobster, a friend of Stein. In other words, we still have very little information to be able to say which way the different scenarios might go. But the reality right now is that the United States has committed a criminal act, an aggression, that it has been preparing a war of aggression. A free jurisprudence, that is, it has been preparing a war of aggression, an aggression against the sovereignty of a country, in other words, against a sovereign country. It hasn't done it for democracy or for freedom. It has done it with all that nonsense we've grown used to from Western leaders. No, Trump said it very clearly. Oil. That is, no oil, he said. No oil, and now we're going to sell it. American companies will be able to do good business. Do people across the Americas realize what this means? What do they want to do now? Follow the sellouts, like in Europe, where sellouts are a plague, or are they ready to respond?
O se disponen a responder. Lamentablemente, los países de las Américas.
Unfortunately, the countries of the Americas have only one possible path, and that is unity of action, to unite. When a small country faces a much more powerful one, this is measured in terms of relative power. That is, what relative power do I have compared to that much larger power? The only way to increase that relative power is by joining with other countries so they can face it together, with everyone contributing to increase their collective relative power. In other words, to reduce, the relative power of the dominant power and be able to confront it. That is the only way out.
Enfrentarme a ella. Y esa es la única salida que hay. Si Latinoamérica no encuentra el camino.
If Latin America doesn't find the path that leads to an increase in that relative power, that is, to unity, in order to confront the United States, then indeed the Monroe Doctrine will be fulfilled under Trump, and they will be dominated and plundered just like in Europe. Don't think that because we're speaking from Spain, things are better in Europe. It's exactly the same here. Exactly the same here. Where a bunch of sellouts in the various European governments devote themselves to doing the same thing, crawling like worms before the emperor in Washington. Finally, a comment, I think it's yours. Well, two. One is, revolutions have to end. I froze. Yes, yes, no.
Me he quedado congelado.
Sí.
Sí, ¿no?
Now you're thawing out. Relax. Now back again.
Ahora de vuelta.
Tienen que acabar liquidando a las fuerzas.
They have to end up eliminating the counter-revolutionary forces. If not, those forces will end up turning against you and stabbing you in the back. Always. The traitor to his country is a miserable coward who sells out for $100,000 shot. And the other comment that needs to be made, the one that disgusts me the most, because from Trump and the gringos you can expect anything. I already said it. I don't know if it was on your show, Ezequiel. I told you that the highest stage of the West is crime. The highest stage of the West is crime. Therefore, the days to come. Now then, all those who go on about Hispanic identity, solidarity with brother countries, the Ibrosphere and all that, who are now all supporting the U.S. aggression against a Hispanic country, should really take a hard look at themselves. Because they're absolutely disgusting. Truly disgusting. I mean, I wouldn't go anywhere near people like that, not even to say good morning. They're profoundly repulsive. Traitors to everything one could imagine. Traitors. The term sellouts is the most accurate one, definitely the most accurate. And well, we'll see each other, right? We'll see, because of course later when things don't go the way they want, it's that the citizens don't vote for us. They don't know how to vote, right? Anyway, that's more or less the way we can read things right now. Everything's up in the air. That's the truth. Everything's up in the air. As for me, well, the information I'm getting more or less from reliable sources is that at TVT, there's been... The New York Times says there were CIA agents inside the Venezuelan government itself.
Actores de la CIA dentro del propio, infiltrados dentro del propio gobierno venezolano, puede ser, no lo sé. Lo dice el New York Times, no lo podemos creer del todo, ¿no?
Maybe, I don't know. The New York Times says it, and we can't fully believe it, but it could be. That would explain some of the things that have happened that we've seen in the last few hours. But it doesn't matter. The issue here is not in the hands of Delcy Rodriguez, or Diosdado Cabello, or Vladimir Padrino. It's in the hands of the Venezuelan people, in the hands of the Bolivarian Revolution. And being traitors, well, you know what must be done with traitors. And as for the esqualidos, all that riffraff who have managed to steal Venezuela's money and take it abroad, and we can see that in Madrid, all those who come here talking about freedom, democracy, and so on, all of them, well, they shouldn't even be allowed to breathe.
Pues que no dejarles ni respirar. Finalmente, solo hay que ver si alguien necesita pruebas.
In the end, you just have to look. If anyone needs proof, if anyone needs, well, that's your opinion, Juan Antonio. But fine, it's just another opinion, no better or worse than any other. If someone needs something to hold on to and say, well, what's the right path here? You just have to review who has supported the Yankee aggression. The European Union, Ukraine, Israel, Ecuador, Milei, Bukele, and so on. The scum of the world, the genocidal, the corrupt, petty tyrants. Cheap Democrats, like those in Brussels, London, Paris, Madrid, or Rome. Mrs. Maloney, it was a defensive operation, says Maloney. A defensive operation.
Es una operación defensiva. Hay que ser imbécil, para sacar unas
You have to be an idiot to make statements like that. Don't say anything. Shut up. Hide. But don't act like an idiot, miss. That's what it shows, a deep stupidity. Though, of course, she's living quite well, as always, at the expense of European workers. Stealing, that you're great at, man. And well, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. Because right now, with the information we have, always with the information we have, you can't be sure of anything. Maybe Trump's move won't work out as well as he expected. Still, the show he's put on for us in the last few hours, what a show he's put on.
¿Qué película nos ha montado?
Muchas gracias, Juan Antonio.
El amigo de Epstein.
Thank you very much, Juan Antonio. Fernando, before your question, or actually as a prompt for your question, here's Ursula von der Leyen's statement from today. Pathetic and disgraceful that this difficult. We are closely following the situation in Venezuela. We stand with the Venezuelan people and support a peaceful and democratic transition. Well then, more of the same, stupid remarks of this kind. Here's Macron's statement. Pay attention to this. The Venezuelan people are today freed from Nicolás Maduro's dictatorship and can only celebrate it. The transition now beginning must be peaceful, democratic, and respectful of the will of the Venezuelan people, among other unrepeatable stupidities. Now my question, based on this mention in both cases, also in the cases of Caja Callas, Starmer, and Maloney, is this. Everyone, basically everyone, keeps hammering on this idea of transition, just as Trump did today in his speech, presenting the idea that from now on, Venezuela seems to be under our management.
Yes, he's going to run Venezuela.
Now, out on the streets, we're witnessing a completely different situation. At least for now, the authorities are still in place. The people haven't started a revolution against the Bolivarian regime, but rather protests in support of it. So, could it be that they're making a blunder here, an error of biblical proportions, in this blatant yet also uncontrolled, chaotic, and anarchic imperialism, in which they want a lot of things but then crash into reality? Or am I making an optimistic mistake, Fernando?
Well, let's see. Juan Antonio has said a lot of things, as always, very interesting, and I'm sure I'll miss many of them. But anyway, I'd like to start, since we're talking about the Europeans and their shameful, lamentable, pathetic, I don't even have the words, that is, the new stance of the Europeans who support a Syrian-style transition. A Syrian-style transition with the head choppers. Fine. Okay. Well, unfortunately, I'll tell you this. He's the last retired politician left in Europe who isn't suspected of being Bolivarian or anything like that. The post he wrote is very short. It's by a man named Dominique de Villepin, thanks to whom, in 2003, Europe managed to hold on to a shred of dignity. Well, this is what Dominique de Villepin says. It's very brief. He says, "This is the legitimization of regime change by force. No matter how repugnant the overthrown governments may be, experience shows that regime change leads neither to democracy nor to peace, but to chaos, civil war, and dictatorship. Let's consider the situations in Iraq or Libya. This is the legitimization of imperial spheres of influence in the name of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as formulated in the National Defense Strategy of December 2017. The barely veiled goal of gunboat diplomacy remains the imposition of an ideological order aligned with Donald Trump's views throughout Latin America. Once the United States ignores the law, What will we say to China if it overthrows a regime it dislikes in Korea, Vietnam, or even more so, in Taiwan? What arguments will we have to offer Russia if it topples a government it dislikes in Moldova or even in the Baltic states? France and Europe must clearly reaffirm, together with the southern countries, their commitment to the principles of international law and, above all, to the sovereignty of states and collective security, and defend the legal order of nation-states against the brutal clash of empires. Dominique de Villepin. It's a shame he's already a retired politician, one of the few who still has some dignity. And, as Juan Antonio said, he said many interesting things, though somewhat disorganizedly, as is usually the case with me. He said, for example, that when there's a revolution, you can't be, let's say, moderate or timid. You have to put an end to the counter-revolutionaries. I've always defended the figure of Maximilien de Robespierre. What he did was what had to be done, and it's what should always be done. Then things might go badly for you, or they might go well. You could have a counter-revolution, but the guillotine is the best deterrent in that regard. We'll see, hopefully I'm wrong, of the three hypotheses Juan Antonio has put forward, whether the Americans, knowingly or not, are leading us toward the first one, the Thucydides trap. Let me explain. Look at the mess they're making. Right now, it's been said in one of those posts on X and so on, and our friend Dmitry Medvedev has said it too. And he says it in his own way, well, in his usual blunt style, but he's absolutely right. He says, the operation in Caracas became the best proof that any state must strengthen its armed forces to the maximum without allowing various wealthy and arrogant actors to casually alter the constitutional order in search of oil or anything else. And the maximum strengthening that guarantees the reliable protection of a country means only one thing, the nuclear arsenal. They are leading us toward the nuclearization of the world, and therefore, toward the possibility that a nuclear war becomes more feasible, more likely, because the more nuclear actors we have, the easier it is for this to get out of hand. Hence the danger of the decaying North American empire, which is leading us to the apocalypse.
No doubt. But let me explain, Fernando. That is, the Thucydides trap is not a decision. No state falls into the Thucydides trap because it wants to, but out of fear. Out of fear. The fear back in the Peloponnesian War was Sparta's fear of Athens, which led to the Thucydides trap. And now the same thing is happening. They know they're losing, they're going to lash out dangerously, and those lashings will keep us up at night. Because this doesn't end here. That is, the empire, imperialism, will try to lash out, will try to maintain a dominant position. And of course, to do that, it will have to commit real atrocities, because otherwise it won't succeed. So yes, indeed, faced with that fear, it could ultimately lead us into the Thucydides trap, but not because they actually want it that way. But of course, in the end, as Medvedev says, ultimately any nation is going to say, look, the only way we can make sure our national security is guaranteed is to start bringing in nuclear missiles and threatening the first one who shows up here. That's the reality.
Exactly. But what's happening is that the example is North Korea. Yes, I completely agree. And then look, right now, this is a bit urgent, but look at the blackmail Venezuela is being subjected to right now. By the way, today, if I'm not mistaken, marks the 36th anniversary of the abduction, or if we want to call it that, kidnapping of Noriega in Panama.
Only that there, it was an invasion of 30,000 troops, and there were more than 2,000 deaths.
Yes, well, possibly more, because he's got the runs and all that. They never really gave any figures. and the numbers that independent researchers have been able to extract push them upward, right? Meaning more people died. But anyway, the issue is the blackmail. What Trump basically told us is we've caught President Maduro, we've kidnapped him, we've taken him away, and now, to the rest of the leaders, the ones we haven't touched, we say, well, go ahead and make a transition, stay in place, in other words, surrender. But we'll more or less let you stay in power because we know that Corina Machado and company are so useless that they're incapable of governing, even if we put them there by force. And besides, here's a letter. Let's see. The Americans make a lot of mistakes and commit major military blunders, but well, we'll see whether they go through with it or not. If they don't go in by land, beyond special operations forces for specific missions, if they don't carry out an invasion, and what they're saying is, as Trump himself says, if you don't surrender, basically, and don't accept what we say, we'll keep bombing, and with greater force. Then what Venezuela will face is a situation with no way out. In other words, a United States that will keep bombing over and over until Venezuela is destroyed.
But that's Libya. That's Libya. Yes, that's Libya. That's Libya. Do you think they mean, look, that would cause, first, a humanitarian disaster on the borders with Colombia and Brazil, naturally a chaotic situation inside the country. It could even lead to a civil conflict. In the end, what's the point? I mean, they've done their calculations. I'd like to think so. Well, let's see. As I always say, there must be rational actors who are not Trump or the clique around him, right? I mean, of course, they must have thought something through. Because obviously, if this is going to be led by Trump and his clique, the blonde narco and the rest, well, then we're doomed. Because this could be an absolute disaster. These guys, let's see, the thing is, of course there are a lot of Trumpists out there who think Trump is something, that Trump is an idiot. He's an idiot surrounded by absolute fools, globalists, I mean Santiago Abascal, globalist, Peter Hesseldahl, that is, an idiot like Trump. Or Steven Mnuchin, the dictator of the Treasury, Soros's right-hand man for many years. But who are these people? They're disgraceful. They're criminals. So indeed, if these are the ones making the decisions, anything could happen in Venezuela. I imagine that in the end, a minimum of rationality will prevail. That is, rationality means you make a cost-benefit calculation. In other words, the mess you're getting into, what it's going to cost you, to finally see what you're going to get out of it. So I think someone will say, well, let's see. There may have been an agreement, or they may have decided on an agreement, to say, look, we can't get rid of Chavismo. The popular support belongs to Chavismo. And that's been clear today. It's been clear today. The streets of Venezuela are supporting the Bolivarian revolution. They're not carrying portraits of Maria Corina Machado or anything like that. The governors are where they're supposed to be. The military commanders are where they're supposed to be. And I don't know if there have been deals made somewhere or agreements, or if they're waiting. Well, I don't know how the situation will evolve. But Delcy Rodriguez's first speech was that the only legitimate president is Nicolás Maduro. And here we are.
Juan Antonio, very briefly, I'm presenting a New York Times column precisely about this. It may be the result of an agreement, or perhaps a miscalculation. The column says that Maduro's inner circle may have survived the US attacks. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, next in the line of succession, and other Venezuelan officials issued defiant statements after Maduro's capture. Delcy Rodriguez, next in the presidential line of succession, was among the Venezuelan officials who made public statements or exerted pressure following the US attacks on targets in the country. Other high-ranking officials allied with Maduro, who apparently survived the attacks, were Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, and the highest-ranking military officer in Venezuela, and Diosdado Cabello, the interior minister and one of Maduro's main operatives in the country. A military war simulation carried out during President Trump's first term assessed what might happen if Maduro were overthrown, predicting chaotic power struggles in which military units, rival political factions, and guerrilla groups would fight for control of the country. Trump seemed hesitant to back Machado. Well, we have to look into it right now, he said on Fox News on Saturday morning when asked if he would support it. He also hinted that his administration would continue targeting Venezuelan government officials if they sided with Maduro. We might be witnessing, in this blatant and unrestrained imperialism, a miscalculation on the part of Trumpism, perhaps also an arrangement to be able to withdraw from this in a somewhat dignified way, after having concentrated so many troops in vain, to create a somewhat dignified exit in front of their electorate, with a Delcy Rodriguez government beginning in place of Maduro. How plausible is that?
No son escenarios contradictorios, ¿eh?
Claro.
They're not contradictory scenarios. That is, they could very well have imagined an operation in which they took out the Venezuelan government's leadership. In other words, kidnapped Maduro. And it could be that indeed the goal was also to eliminate him. It's a decapitation operation, similar to the one attempted in Iran, and in fact they managed to decapitate much of the leadership, both military and political. Here, the only thing they've managed, at least initially, is to kidnap Maduro, but the rest are all still there. It's not just that they're all there, it's that they've gathered. We saw them together this afternoon, the entire Venezuelan government. I imagine that afterward each of them went to their bunkers and the designated locations from which they have to direct operations. Could the United States try to continue its military operation, attempting to decapitate the leadership? Well, I don't know how Chavismo has proceeded, but if I were in their place, right now I'd have not one, but 2 or 3 alternative chains of command, depending on what might happen. If they take out so-and-so, no problem. Within a few hours, they'll appoint someone else to carry on.
There's a problem, Juan Antonio. And it's that, as I said, if they don't make mistakes, which is very typical of the Americans as we've seen in many wars, if they don't set foot on the ground, which is where there could be resistance and armed struggle from the Venezuelan population, the blackmail is, look, you, unlike Trump, who doesn't give a damn about Americans, that is, about U.S. citizens, you, who actually care about your people, I'll put you in this position. Either you do more or less what I want, and look, ultimately, I'll let you handle this, because we know the opposition is incapable of managing itself, of managing absolutely anything, because they're incompetent and corrupt, and in exchange, you don't destroy the country. Because let's face it, the Venezuelan army, the Venezuelan population, cannot fight against the United States if the United States doesn't set foot on the ground. That is, they can be bombed as much as they want. All critical infrastructure can be destroyed, and they can be pushed back to the Paleolithic era. And leaders who care about their people might say, we simply have no alternative. Because in truth, right now, they have no political, military, or economic alternative. They're being blocked on all fronts, mainly by Russia and China. There's very little they can do, apart from lodging diplomatic protests at the Security Council. Russia has its hands full with the war in Ukraine and with facing NATO. And as I was saying, in the end, Venezuela, unfortunately for Venezuelans, is very far from both China and Russia. That is to say, China already has enough on its plate having to face that so-called first line of defense, or attack. Well, that first line the Americans have in the Pacific, along with the pressure from the Philippines, Japan, and so on. In other words, there's not much that can be done. And I really think that unless the Americans make mistakes, which they do quite often, meaning they can easily mess things up, the options are terrible. They're terrible because we're talking about leaders who actually think about their population. We're not talking about leaders like Trump, who couldn't care less, or like the Europeans, who couldn't care less about their own citizens.
A question about something you just mentioned. You were just presenting Medvedev's words. We also showed them earlier today. This operation in Caracas has become the best proof that any state must strengthen its armed forces to the maximum, not allowing several rich and arrogant actors to casually change the constitutional order in search of oil or something else. And that maximum strengthening, which guarantees reliable protection for a country, means only one thing: a nuclear arsenal. Long live nuclear weapons.
Que vivan las armas nucleares. Medvedev, pero el otro día en la primera emisión.
But the other day, in the first broadcast of Demoliendo Mitos on Patreon, we presented the interview with Karaganov, a Russian geostrategist and advisor to Putin, Yeltsin, and Gorbachev, in which he basically calls for lowering the nuclear threshold and for Russia to begin using nuclear weapons much more quickly than it would under the current doctrine. Should Latin America, then, abandon the treaties signed by Latin American countries with nuclear development? Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. Should it abandon the treaties for the exclusively civilian development of its nuclear capacity and begin nuclear armament?
Lleva muchos años tardando, sí.
Yes, it's been taking many years. Yes. Yes, unfortunately, yes. I agree with Juan Antonio. Why? Because we've seen it. This is the umpteenth time, I've lost count, that the United Nations has proven to be absolutely useless. Completely useless. It's an utterly farcical organization. I mean, international law is treated the same way the United States treats it. So faced with this, your only defense is, look, in a situation where they do whatever they want, there is no international law, the United Nations isn't even worth the paper for debate, and I have no choice to defend myself but to go nuclear. This is what the Americans are forcing every country that can, that has the capacity to do. Iran, I don't know what they're plotting. Because here's the thing. Once they're done with this Venezuela issue, Netanyahu and company are already getting ready to stir things up again in the Middle East. There's no other way. That's why I was saying, this disaster, this irresponsibility, this recklessness, whatever you want to call it, on the part of the American leaders, born of their stupidity, is rapidly leading us toward a nuclear war. And in Russia's case, we're seeing it with Karaganov and others. The positions of the people who matter in Russia are getting tougher and tougher. How could they not? I mean, when Europeans are telling them we're heading for war by 2030 at the latest. In the end, the hardline positions will prevail in every country, because that's the only possible response. And that's where we are.
Technical question about this, Juan Antonio. In the case of developing a nuclear weapon in Argentina or Brazil, at a considerable distance from the United States, what would be the possible delivery system? What would be the possible launch method for one of these weapons against a potential aggressor, possibly the United States?
From Brazil, the ideal thing would be an Oresnik missile.
Of course.
That is, it has a range of 5,500 kilometers. It doesn't have to be an intercontinental missile or anything like that. It has 6 nuclear warheads, and they won't be able to intercept it. A Sarmat missile.
Look, today they've also threatened Colombia and Cuba, huh?
Yes, yes, yes. Look, that nightclub thug has been going around threatening everyone. Yes, yes. I mean, what I don't understand is how people don't see it. But look, it's true that the issue of nuclearization, the need for unity to stand up to the powerful, but the problem is also what Latin American governments are like. And here we have to make the same criticism we make of the Europeans, of the European governments whom we call out because they are what they are. a pile of guano. But the same must be said about Latin American governments. By now, CELAC should have met, ALBA should have met, even the OAS should have met. By now, there should be a chain of Latin American countries breaking off diplomatic relations with the United States.
But look, even the African Union has already come out protesting and condemning, and still, as you say, no one has met yet.
By now, Petro should be telling the United States to start withdrawing its bases from Colombia. By now. I mean, Lula himself, or Mrs. Scheinbaum from Mexico, should be saying, look, I'm going to close the border. I want nothing to do with you. You're a criminal and a delinquent, surrounded by a gang of criminals. That's what you are, the United States. A disgrace to the world. A disgrace to the world. But let's see, review history, pick up a history book, go on. But really, since 1898, remember, against Spain, the genocide in the Philippines. They eliminated Spanish as a language in the Philippines. 1 million dead. They exterminated the Indians. I mean, it's a disgrace for the world. And well, here we are consuming their shitty culture, which is total crap. Here we are still consuming their products. Here we are still feeding the power. The oldest democracy, the oldest modern democracy. Idiots. We're idiots. We're idiots. And there lies now the dignity of the peoples of the Americas. They should be seeing themselves in that. You break off diplomatic relations and you leave. You leave. And if not, well, today it happened to Venezuela, tomorrow it will happen to Nicaragua, then to Mexico, or to Colombia, or to Cuba.
Or to Brazil.
Or to Brazil. And you just wait as they cut you down one by one, when maybe together you could actually put up a good fight.
As you pointed out, Juan Antonio, that requires a unity that I currently see as impossible. Just as in Europe, I see it as unfeasible to have a movement that would bring an end to the European Union. Right now, it's unfeasible.
The European Union will come to an end because it's going to collapse on its own.
Yes, no, because Russia is going to win the war, and that will be the end of NATO and the European Union.
A question about the immediate future. Generally speaking, these regime change operations, a specialty of the United States, a specialty of Great Britain, dozens carried out since the post-war period, usually with the same result. Not infrequently, the United States has been able to achieve its objectives, even from its own perspective, its own goals. Usually, they end up generating disaster, chaos, and so on. But beyond that, in all these operations, the days immediately following the first attack determine a number of fundamental issues for the development and future of the countries that are attacked. To what extent could the United States carry out a new attack, something mentioned by Trump, but apparently unlikely? To what extent could riots or internal disputes break out in Venezuela? What are we going to witness in the coming days, in your opinion? Whoever wants to start, go ahead.
En opinión de ustedes, quien quiera comenzar, adelante.
Empiezo yo, porque ya se me va agotando el tiempo.
I'll start because I'm running out of time. Look, if somehow, through direct or indirect communications, because there may be actors who are right now talking to both sides, if by some kind of, well, the word agreement sounds like they're accomplices, and that's not what I mean. I mean, if there were some sort of understanding, like, okay, I'll stop here, the Bolivarian regime stays, but under certain conditions, then there won't be any more attacks. And that would, logically, be the opposition's failure. I mean, a ridiculous, utterly embarrassing failure. And let's say each side would be trying to buy time to somehow rebuild its strength and adjust its strategy to the new situation. That's one possibility. If there hasn't been that understanding or that intervention by actors seeking de-escalation or in some way trying to see how both sides can come out of this looking good, that is, Trump saying, we went and did what we had to do, then you haven't done anything. You've kidnapped a president, and we'll see how that turns out for you. You haven't done anything else. Drop a bomb. That's something the United States is really good at, bombing people. But let's see. But nothing more than that. If there isn't that attempt, then what's he going to do next week? He has no choice, as Fernando says, but to keep bombing, to keep attacking, because otherwise it's an absolute failure. So of course, we don't know if that's what's happening. Which of the scenarios is actually taking place? We'll find out in the coming days, and we'll have to stay alert and watch the scenarios unfold in the next few days to see what really ultimately happens. And from there, we'll be able to draw conclusions. And besides, in the end, these things get out, they leak. There have been conversations. So-and-so has called Trump. He's spoken with the Venezuelan government, and it might be possible to look for a face-saving way out for all parties. If Trump keeps insisting on bombing and keeps thinking there's going to be a change in the election, that he's going to govern Venezuela and that American companies are going to make huge profits from stealing the oil, then, well, the situation logically is different, right? Right now, at this moment, based on what we know, what's the situation?
Por lo que sabemos, ¿cuál es la situación? La situación es que Estados Unidos ha hecho una agresión.
The situation is that the United States has committed a criminal act of aggression typical of a gang of delinquents, which is what exists there. Criminal elites, and even more criminal deep state, and a group of allies in Europe who are the shame of humanity. It has launched an act of aggression and kidnapped the president of a sovereign state, of course, trampling on international law, mocking the United Nations and everything else, values, the rules-based order, and Western values. Exactly. So, well, this is what we know now. And that, as a result, the Venezuelan government has acted according to the Constitution, and the interim president is the former vice president of the Chavista government, Delcy Rodriguez, with the same ministers who were already in place. That's the situation right now. Anything else is speculation because we don't have more information. That's how things stand. Does that mean the U.S. operation has been successful? If things stay this way, it's an absolute failure. Yes, they've managed to get a pawn, Nicolás Maduro. But from a geopolitical, geoeconomic, and image standpoint, it's an absolute failure. Will it stay that way? So an absolutely uncertain scenario opens up, because many things could happen, from a regime change or the chaotic collapse of Venezuela to civil war, or even the entire Caribbean turning into a hellish place. So which of these scenarios are we moving toward? We'll know very soon. We'll know very soon. I hope, listen to what I'm saying, that for the sake of the people, it's the first one. That in the end, Trump saves face by saying, I've got Maduro to put him on trial. I don't know, let's see, about the fairness of that trial. Forgive me for laughing, it's a parody. Forgive me for laughing at the supposed fairness of that trial. But well, maybe, who knows, perhaps Nicolás Maduro has accepted that sacrifice. He could actually be turned into a martyr, a political prisoner, because that's what he is right now, a political prisoner, which clearly shows the sinister nature of democracy in America. And maybe he has accepted that sacrifice, and well, it will give people a lot to talk about in the future. But from a strategic point of view, it would be a failure for the United States.
Me, just a couple of things. One, I agree with what Juan Antonio says. Now, what the Venezuelan government has to do is buy time. That is, they need to reach some kind of agreement. If they do, we'll see, because we know Trump has many open fronts and will probably move on to Iran afterward.
Or anywhere else. I hope that in 10 months Trump becomes a lame duck, unable to get a damn law passed in Congress, in the Senate, or anywhere. And maybe, with a bit of luck, they'll impeach him and send him packing.
The problem is that the alternative, which is the Democrats, is just as unacceptable. I mean, that's the problem. But you buy time. Of course. Buying time, that's essential. And then we'll have to see, and Juan Antonio knows more about this. There have been, as far as we know, more than 40 attacks on military facilities and critical infrastructure. I, for example, have seen 2 previous systems destroyed.
Then we'll have to assess. It must be said they were very old from that time. Yes.
Let's be honest. The weapons Venezuela has can't stand up to the weapons the United States has. That's just how it is. But even so, we'll have to see, since we still don't know, the damage that's been done.
To those bases, those airports, those anti-air defense systems, and so on. It seems the attack was very severe, but we don't really know. But Fernando, that's where other players, other actors also have to show their claws. That's where, since we're talking about $2 billion in damages, a country like China has to say, don't worry, here are the $2 billion.
You have to keep the fronts open. There, what you point out, China has invested $60 billion in Venezuela and another $17 billion, and it has open oil fields in the Orinoco. But the problem here is that Putin and Xi Jinping need to talk. Maybe they already have, I don't know. They need to realize one thing, that in the face of a declining empire, extremely dangerous, precisely because it's in decline and unwilling to, let's say, give up its hegemony and is going to go down fighting, they must coordinate in such a way as to counter these fronts that are being opened up and support their allies, so to speak, around the world.
This has probably been discussed. What else do we see? A management of escalation. That is, you also have to take into account how we respond so that the wounded beast doesn't strike again, that it tries to bite as little as possible. That's called escalation management. But undoubtedly, if I were the Chinese ambassador in Caracas right now, I would have asked my government for instructions. And at this moment, the message would be this. Don't worry about the damages. They're covered.
The last one, very brief. As we show images here, courtesy of our sister channel Wars and Geopolitics on Telegram, we see the arrival of the plane transporting Maduro to New York just moments ago. At least, this would be the plane allegedly carrying Maduro for what would indeed be the start of a truly nightmarish, circus-like trial. The trial of a president kidnapped by a country in the context of imperial aggression. Madness, sheer madness.
We already know what it's going to be. A mock trial, an absolute farce.
Let the guilty one enter the room. The last question for both of you. So far, the European authorities have reacted with true disgrace to this, and possibly on the list of priorities, due to Netanyahu's visit to the United States a few days ago, Iran will appear first, and only second will be Greenland. Now, how will Europe react in the possible event of a takeover of Greenland?
I'll put it simply. With Denmark's unconditional surrender, they're going to give it to them.
It's going to be an impressive advance toward the rear, indeed a retreat toward the rear. Yes, an advance toward the rear. In fact, I think Greenland will come before Iran. Yes, that could be. Israel is putting on a lot of pressure, right? And Netanyahu and all those good people, right? They're all saints. I mean, I think that why? Because if we look at all this, it's focused on the issue of dominating the Western Hemisphere. And Greenland is key. It's in the Western Hemisphere. I think the next step might be Greenland. Iran carries many risks. They couldn't handle the 12-day war, and maybe they'll try again. But there's no longer the element of surprise, no decapitation operation.
¿Mm? Intentan desestabilizar con las protestas.
They're trying to destabilize things with the protests, Mossad agents moving around and all that, but careful, it's more dangerous. And besides, it's not the same thing, a convinced Shiite who's willing to sacrifice himself in a war, as a Caribbean comrade who has to fight. He fights, but it's not the same mindset. So I think, look, I dare say that possibly the next target, regardless of how things end in Venezuela, the next target, I don't know, since he's threatened Colombia and Mexico, but come on, I'm sure Greenland is on the list, marked already. And what's Europe going to do? Well, run backward, advance toward the rear.
Avanzar hacia la retaguardia.
En directo, primeras imágenes de Maduro en...
Live, first images of Maduro in the United States. By the way, 7,000 viewers connected and around 3,000 likes. Please help us fight censorship by giving a thumbs up. Also remember, as we show these images, to follow us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can support us through memberships, which we reactivated recently. You can also do so via our PayPal account and join us on Patreon since the beginning of this year, just a few days ago, where we basically share what we can't show here. The link is in the description, of course. Here, we have Maduro getting off the plane in New York.
En Nueva York, esto. Qué suspenso.
Yes, they're there. Well, they're getting it ready so it can go down the stairs.
Yeah, they'll have to set up the stage, right?
Of course, indeed, we have to set up the media circus.
They'll have to add a few things, of course.
So it can be seen. And they don't put shackles on him like they do in U.S. prisons because it looks really bad. Besides, getting down is harder, the stairs of an airplane.
Well, just updated the video and missed the moment. But anyway, there's RT, folks. Beyond this slip-up from RT so far, it's one of the few more or less independent outlets on this issue. RT and Telesur, by the way. RT is censored in Europe, and Telesur, halfway. There's freedom of speech for all of us. Or we follow the line of France 24 in favor of the invasion, Deutsche Welle in favor of the invasion, BBC in favor of the invasion, or the US media in favor of the invasion. Or we have to jump through hoops to access media with a critical view, banned in Europe, like RT and Telesur. From here to a dictatorship, it's just a tiny step, right here in Europe.
We're on it. We're on the right track.
Yes. Wrap it up however you like. Fernando, would you like to say a few words about the end of the war, or whatever you want?
Briefly, what I said before, I think we need to be aware. First, the thesis I'm putting forward is that we are in a world war that has nothing to do with World War II, a hybrid world war, but one in which the American empire is operating on a kind of global chessboard, in Venezuela, in Europe with the issue of Ukraine, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. In other words, the empire is moving everywhere and moving its pieces. Therefore, we are in a world war. And against the empire, the two main leaders, let's say, in opposition, are Russia and China, clearly. And they have to take the initiative and be fully aware that it's fine to be cautious, but sometimes excessive caution gives the impression of weakness. And then what it causes is an escalation, even if that's not your intention. In other words, they have to take a stand. And take a stand seriously, like Putin did at the time with the issue of Ukraine and NATO. Well, they have to take a stand against these constant aggressions all over the globe by the United States, one after another. That doesn't mean they have to go to war or start doing the same things the Americans do. No, there are many ways. We've seen how China, with rare earths, brought the Americans to a screeching halt, and Trump had to react in a rush because otherwise they'd be eaten alive in the United States. They'd go back to the Neolithic. Well, they have many tools, and they need to start using them, and not just, let's say, play defensively. right? They need to take the initiative. And if not, we'll see more wars, more disaster. The sooner we stop the United States, the better for everyone. And as I said before, the best thing that could happen in the United States, we don't know if it will happen or not in the future, would be a civil war. That would be the best thing for the world, for humanity. And then keep this in mind. Remember that, well, as I was saying, watch out. Trump and the United States in general, even during Biden's time, all the aggressions they carry out in Venezuela, in other countries, regime changes, for example, in Nepal, pushing Thailand, which is a U.S. ally with American military equipment, against Cambodia, and many others, are ultimately aimed at China. In other words, I can crush anyone who trades with China. The United States has realized, after running a bunch of simulations and so on, that in a more or less direct war against China, they would lose. All they need to do is throw China's surroundings into chaos.
The footage of Maduro getting off the plane. Juan Antonio, your closing remarks, whatever you want. Go ahead.
Well, maybe they really did put the shackles on him, Fernando.
Damn. Well, yeah, because the guy goes down. The guy goes down really well.
It's just that the United States, this guy, what if he gets away? He's running faster every time and they can't catch him anymore.
No, and what they should have. It's just that since they're immigrants and don't know the history, but a triumph, like the Romans used to do with Trump in the chariot and with something like that, right? Because that's the only thing they're missing.
Let's see, to wrap up, we've just witnessed yet another episode that's a symptom of a world order in transition. A world order that's coming to an end while a new one is being built. And what will define this phase is hard power over international law. International law, the UN, all that. Let's forget about it. That's scrap now. All of that is scrap. In other words, hard power will prevail. Hard power in terms of industrial capacity, military resilience, and so on among nations. And the friction points will be, as almost always in geopolitics and geoeconomics, wherever there are contested strategic resources.
Allí donde haya recursos estratégicos disputados. ¿Por qué? Porque esos recursos son los fundamentales.
Why? Because those resources are essential to try to stop China's rise or to allow the United States to maintain its own development. And for that, it needs every possible resource. It needs European industries, it needs the mineral resources of the Americas, and it's going to steal them to plunder them because its future depends on them. That's the situation we're in. So today we've seen yet another sign. It won't be the last. It won't be the last. So, well, it's up to the people to decide what they want to do.
Bueno, allá los pueblos lo que quieran hacer. Allá los ciudadanos de los distintos países lo que quieran hacer.
It's up to the citizens of each country to do what they want. They can go on being slaves, putting up with and swallowing all this, I don't even know what to call it, all this Western nonsense about values, rules, the right side of history, and other such crap. They can keep going like that, or they can decide it's time to say, well, that's enough. We're going to fight for freedom, for sovereignty, for independence, as that Argentine once said, for a just, free, and sovereign homeland. And that's the situation. It's up to each person, up to each people. But then let's not complain because, hey, since we're talking about Latin America, let's say it. In Spain, we often hear about the suffering over those 500 years, but you've already been independent for 200. Maybe the time has come, and I say this from a shattered Europe, that really, this is the future. What I can say about Hispanic America is very little compared to what we say about Europe. But really, we need to face the situation. What we suffered 500 years ago no longer matters, not even the glories of independence 200 years ago. 200 years have passed, and the boot, first the Anglos and now the Gringos, is still pressing on your necks, and it will stay that way unless something is done. And European experience tells us the same. Occupied for 80 years, slaves to vomit-inducing repugnant elites. So in other words, the boot already weighs heavily on us, and we're longing for this to end. So man, those peoples of America, look, I don't want to name names, there would be many. Ezequiel just mentioned one, but we could mention Ernesto, right? We have to put an end to the oligarchies. We could name so many who have fought for that great homeland, for that free America. Let's see if someone will have to take up the torch and continue that struggle. If not, we'll be left with the pitiful spectacle of seeing how a head of government, a head of state of an American country, is kidnapped because some crook, some thug, a nightclub bully, a friend of his, has decided with his gang of bandits that they can do whatever they want.
Well, here we are making a contribution to that struggle for the freedom of the peoples of the Americas. We're contributing to the cultural battle, to the spread of critical thinking. Now the responsibility lies with the demolishers, men and women, to help spread this in the United States, to promote this, as well as all our analyses here. Tomorrow, we'll be back again with Fernando Moragon. You can join us on Patreon. Remember that too. On Monday or Tuesday, we'll be posting a new reaction there about the terminal phase of Zionism. What we can't post here, we post there. Already 93 new subscribers in these first 2 days, so everyone's invited. Fernando and Juan Antonio, a real privilege as always. To Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, 1,000 thanks again, and until next time.
Bye-bye. Bye. See you later.